they go.
Hello and welcome to Angel's Costumes Behind the Seams. I'm Jeremy Angel.
I'm Richard Green.
And I'm Jonathan Littman. And I'm thrilled that we have Sinéad Kidao on our podcast this week. She's a really exciting young designer who has done her time, if that's the right expression, with big designers, Jaqueline Durran, Lindy, and learned the ropes by assisting and being around and working very hard. And I've watched her from a little fledgling, and now she is currently designing her first major television.
Her feathers.
Yes, fluffing her feathers.
Spreading her wings.
And she's spread her wings. She's off. And,
yeah, she is.
Doing very well. And it's been a pleasure to work with her in her capacity as designer on a big period drama.
And what an amazing, we talk about the various ways people come to this business and, various approaches, but actually being in a village where they're filming on location, there's got to be a first, hasn't it?
It's like a scene out of Ryan's Daughter.
Could you imagine that happening now for a fitting, that someone had a fitting here and they turned up with 5 of their grandchildren to the fitting because they just, that's what they wanted to do.
Well, for a start, they wouldn't get in.
Not now, but it's amazing, absolutely amazing, and completely the right designer to do it for, because Lindy loves those sorts of stories.
Yes.
Yeah. And embraced by her, and then years on, and time and circumstance, and Sinead's in London, and I think it's nice when you get that serendipitous.
Yeah, it's a lovely story. It's a really nice story.
It's also the thing that you're talking about, spreading her wings, Jonathan, and sort of cutting her teeth with big designers on other productions. If you look at the productions she worked on to do all of that, it was a complete mix. She had your big blockbusters in the Wonder Womans and Little Women, but she also then did some smaller productions as well with those people. So she got a really good feel for it at the real pointed edge of the pointy bit of the wedge, I suppose. Because
the pointy end of the stick.
Yes, at the pointy end of the stick.
What I particularly noticed about Sinead over the years is that it's what she doesn't say. She's not the sort of designer that has verbosity or pomposity. It's very considered and thoughtful, and I think her process learning as an assistant was absolutely key to the situation that she's in now. And what often happens is that it's sort of, I suppose this is the expression I want to use is crumbs from a table. But what by developing a good, strong, solid relationship with a costume designer, there will be a point, if that collaboration is working in the right way, where Jaqueline or Lindy will be approached, as an example of a designer, will be approached to do a job that they can't do for whatever reason, and they'll say, and this is the ideal scenario, and it happened to me. They'll say, I can't do it, but
yeah.
And then that gives someone like Sinead the opportunity to fly, and they've been empowered by their designer because they've learned their craft, and then off they go, and that's a wonderful process.
Well, and that's the way it should be, isn't it? You learn, and again, we keep banging on about this, but this isn't or shouldn't be a 5-minute Cinderella transformation moment. This is people learning their craft, putting in their hours, putting in the time, putting in the work, making, in fact, the contacts and networking to a certain extent, but not in that kind of aggressive way that we've all experienced, where somebody's right in your face about things.
Well, the dialogue that Sinead undertook with me in terms of her preparation for this current project that she's working on, and throughout the process, is completely and utterly the conversation that she's learned from working with the people that she's worked with.
Yeah.
So, and I respect that. I think that's incredibly important, and I hope she goes far with it.
And the other thing with the whole scenario you just explained, which is with your the crumbs on the table thing, is on top of all of that, as you explained with your side of things when we did your interview, Jonathan, is it's a huge vote of from the production's point of view. If the designer says, I know you want me, but the next best person to me is X, so you've got the whole, you don't need to jump too far away from me. But the second thing is, it's a massive vote of confidence for Sinead that she knows she was put forward by whether it's Jaqueline.
Yeah.
So it works so many ways. So it's lovely. And just looking through Sinead's career and what she's worked on, and I mentioned this earlier on today to Richard, when you start looking at, for example, Black Mirror seems to be becoming a very good place for costume designers who are sort of, it's a really good place to go. If you look at who the other designers who've done Black Mirror, Jaqueline Durran's done one, and Guy Speranza, Jane Petrie, Edward Gibbons, Claire Anderson, Natalie Ward. You've got all these designers at Verity Hawks, Barbara Kidd, and Sinead, and it's not a bad thing to have on your CV, and it seems to be a very good production to be.
Well, the production values of that
series
is high, and they've considered the creatives that they bring in. You know, they've made that a very important factor in the presentation.
No,
and
definitely.
as standalone stories, it's a perfect little exercise, isn't it?
No, it's great. It's great, and it was generally only suddenly looking through all the designers that they've been on there, and you're like, that's actually a fantastic group to be part of. So,
if I'm not mistaken, I think Guy Speranza's one was directed by Jodie Foster.
I know Guy did 3, I think.
One of them was, and I, you know, what an amazing environment to be in, working with somebody of her experience, and I to come within that orbit, and for him to present his work on that platform is great. So yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah.
We hope you've been enjoying these conversations. We've certainly been enjoying your feedback. If you have any questions or queries, please do contact us on podcast@angels.co.uk. You can visit our website, which is www.angelsbehindtheseams.com, or you can find us on social media. We are on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. We are /costume podcast. And here is Jonathan's chat with Sinead.
Here we are today on a rather gloomy grey Monday, but we will be enlightened and brightened by Sinead Kidao. Pronounce your last name for me.
Kidao.
Kidao.
Kidao, yeah. I always say it's like pow, but like Kidao, you know, like in a Batman.
I quite like pow.
Kidao.
No, that's great. So that's clarified that one up, because I've always questioned that one. Welcome, Sinead, and I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you very much for having me.
And I think it's very exciting because, you know, you're on a bit of a crossroads threshold in terms of your career and what you've been building up to for the last number of years, and what you've actually achieved yourself as a designer in the last, should I say, a year with you know, the Steve McQueen, and now what you're about to embark upon.
Yeah, it's about a year. It's a year since I've been designing on my own.
And I think that's testament to your temerity and your skill and your observation. Would you agree with that?
That's a very nice thing to say. Yeah, I mean, it's been kind of nerve-wracking of a year, and it's sort of that thing of going out on your own is always quite daunting. But yeah, I've enjoyed it so far, so fingers crossed.
You look like you enjoy it, because I've been watching you especially over the last year, and you know, the work that's been coming through, and the projects that you've undertaken as an assistant, and then of course the small work that you've done in order to kind of flex your muscles and get into the vibe of designing under your own auspices has been an interesting journey. And in terms of how we're structuring these conversations, I'd like to take our audience and you back to the beginning and ask you what was your introduction to the industry? Where did you first know about the concept of costume design, and that there could be a possible job that realized that, you know, that artistic ambition?
Well, funny enough, the first time I ever knew of costume as an idea was when I was about 7, and a film called All Things Bright and Beautiful was being filmed in the town where my grandparents lived, and they got an audition to be extras, And then they got the part. And when they went for their fitting, they decided to bring myself and about 6 of my cousins along to their costume fitting, which, when I think about it now, if anyone turned up for a costume fitting and they brought like 6 of their grandchildren with them, you just think they were so mad. But we were all so excited, and there was a marquee, and we thought the marquee was so fancy. And then my auntie came along for their next costume fitting, and she decided to get a job in the costume department. I don't think they paid her, but it was Lindy Hemming was the costume designer. And my grandparents were saying, oh, we've got loads of 1950s clothes at home, you know. So Lindy came up to the house and took a load of the costumes, well, clothes that my grandparents had in the attic, and actually ended up using them. And then afterwards, it's just like such a small world. But afterwards, actually, Lindy sent the costumes back in Angel's bags. And I remember being, because I was about 7 or 8, looking at these bags and thinking, oh my God, where is this mystical, magical place called Angels? And I actually kind of forgot about that. But then I was always interested in fashion and drawing. And I went to Trinity and studied, I just randomly chose to study drama and French, but then started working on the plays that were in the Drama Society. And I got a job as a dresser in Smock Alley Theatre. And one of our lecturers there actually recommended that I apply to go to RADA and do the theatre costume course that they had there. So I applied and got in. And it was only actually at my graduation there, and my auntie came over to see it, and she said, oh my God, you're going to be just like Lindy. And when we'd been at RADA, they'd spoken about Lindy Hemming, who had gone to RADA and who'd been an Oscar-winning costume designer. And it was only at the graduation that I actually put 2 and 2 together, that she'd been the costume designer who'd been in our house, who'd kind of borrowed all those clothes. And then just by chance, through then going on to work with Jaqueline, I then went on to actually assist Lindy. So it was like a really weird, small world.
Circles within circles.
Yeah.
And it is a small world because, as information has evolved through these chats that we've been having with, all different practitioners, the serendipity and the coincidence of how people evolve to find the positions that they find themselves in is sort of intriguing. So when that connection was made at the point of your graduation, and you'd gone through your, if you like, your academic training, and you then decided that you were going to forge ahead and make a career of this, was that all based on being in London, or had you gone home by then?
No, so I went to London primarily to study, but that was around the time when I graduated was when the big recession hit, and there weren't as many opportunities in Ireland at that time, but there were a lot more in London. And so I decided to stay in London. But I'd primarily wanted to work in theatre, and I didn't really know a huge amount about film because RADA doesn't really focus that much on film. It's very much theatre based. But I think in a way, actually, you get a really good training because you learn a lot of practical skills. It's very vocational. You're working on all the shows there. You're meeting lots of different people. You're kind of coming up with different actors and designers at the same time. And just by chance, when I'd been at Trinity, my dissertation had been on the semiotics of costume, and I'd studied Mike Lee. And he then went and did a talk at RADA. And I asked him a question at the talk, and afterwards I met him, and he said, oh, you know what? Why don't you get in touch with my costume designer, which was Jaqueline Durran. Mm-hmm. And I sent her an email, and I was sort of economical with the truth of how well I knew Mike Lee. And so he said, oh, come in and meet us. And so I'd never really kind of thought about film that much, but only for going in to meet Jaqueline and then her giving me a job, I then suddenly was working in film, and I actually haven't gone back to theatre since. So it's over 10 years ago now.
And your first job in her department was as what?
So as a trainee.
Right.
So she brought me on, and actually she brought me on as work experience on the proviso because she thought I knew Mike. So she was like, oh, we'll have to give her some sort of job. Then after a week or two, she said, oh, we need to get you a paid job. And so they gave me a job as a paid trainee, and then I've just pretty much been working with her since.
And was that on Happy Go Lucky?
No, it was called A Running Jump. It was like a short film he did. I think it was 2008. And Yeah, so it was a short film, so it was only kind of, I think, 6 weeks we worked on it for.
And how during that time were you making ends meet?
So, I mean, I'm incredibly lucky that when I went to university was free. So when I came over to London, I got a grant, and then it was only about 3 weeks of work that I had to work as work experience. And that was literally just as I finished at RADA,
Mm-hmm.
and then went on and got paid work, which I think is the brilliant thing about film, is that people tend not to keep you on work experience in the way that they make you, do it in fashion design, I guess. In film and TV, you can get a job as a paid trainee and work your way up from there. So yeah, that's how I made it ends meet in the beginning.
And that takes a certain amount of skill and sort of temerity, because it's not, you have alluded to sort of various coincidences, and then you have the opportunity to prove your worth within the department. But to maintain that and sustain it is not an easy task. You've got to be prepared to work all hours and watch and be aware of everything that's going on around you.
Yeah, I think one thing I always say is that it's really, in our industry, various people get their first job in various ways, but how you get your second job is really just by working hard, because people may give you a chance, or you may write an email at the right time and someone be willing to give you a job, but they will never bring you on into another job unless you work really hard. So I think that's the one thing I've always thought about this, is you have to really love it, and you have to be willing to work all hours of the day, and because you love it. And in a way, that's what theatre teaches you, because when we were at RADA and when we were working on plays, you're working all hours of the day just to get something done. And so then going into working in film was very similar in a way, but at least in film we were getting paid, which
and that stamina and endurance has a remunerative value, which perhaps in theatre is harder to quantify, because the structure of pay and the conditions are so different. So in a sense, you jumped into an opportunity and created a situation for yourself, which a lot of people spend many, many years trying to work out a way of accessing it. And it is about the foot in the door, isn't it? And then it's down to you to prove your worth. What was the next job then that Jaqueline took you on to?
I think it might have been Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. I did one of the Batman films as a trainee,
right,
in between. So after we did the Mike Lee, I think Jaqueline put me forward to go, and then so that was with Lindy designing and Dan Gray supervising, and so I was on that for nearly a year as a trainee, and then halfway through became a buyer, and then I think I went to work with Jaqueline on Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy after that.
I presume you had the opportunity to tell Lindy the story.
Yeah, I did.
The connection.
Yeah, because I even have my aunt still has handwritten letters. I mean, it meant so much to my grandparents and my aunt at the time. It was like the most exciting thing that had happened in our town, and they just loved the whole experience. So my aunt still has letters that Lindy sent her saying thank you afterwards, and kind of keeping in touch for a few years after.
Amazing. And Lindy's such a generous person in that respect, to sort of draw, knowing that somebody's interested, and then to draw them into the world is very much how she operates. So I'm really pleased about that. Nice story.
Lindy always says, and Lindy's partner Bob, they're like, of course we remember you. I think a random 7-year-old, but no, it's quite funny.
Well, you never know. You may have made some indelible print into their memory, and away you go. The interesting thing about what you said in terms of how one has to keep going is that I always associate the best of times with this work that we do as being in the summer, the longest days. And in fact, your working relationship with Jaqueline, sort of just before you came along, Jaqueline and I used to have a working relationship together, because she was employed by Angels before she left to do her MA and then freelance. And one of the things that I remember most about that time when we were working together were these very, very long days that we used to have working at Shaftesbury Avenue in the summer, and leaving invariably sort of between 9 and 10 o'clock at night, and just not knowing where the hours had gone. And because you're so absorbed in the project that you are working on, whatever it might be. And I think that it's an interesting character attribute for all designers, that that your passion for the project becomes all consuming.
Yeah.
And that's how you are able to invariably produce your best work.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't know how to work for just 8 hours a day, and I know that sounds, there is a certain aspect where, you know, in our job, I think people should go home and people shouldn't work any longer than they need to. But as a designer, particularly as I've been in the last year, you know, there's just always more things you can read. There's almost more things you can look up. You just always feel like you could do more. And but it's so rewarding when you actually do really enjoy your job that you don't mind doing it. I mean,
there's no switch off, is there?
No, there isn't. But I'd rather be doing something that I love for 16 hours a day than something that I hate for half of that. So
absolutely,
yeah.
And just bringing our audience like up to date now, bearing in mind the circumstances that we're currently in with shutdown and confusion, you're about to restart on a rather marvelous project, The Pursuit of Love, and that's a BBC production.
Yeah, it's a BBC, so three-parter, so 3 episodes, based on Nancy Mitford's The Pursuit of Love. So yeah, it's a really lovely, it's like a gift of a job from a design point of view, because it's 1920s, 1930s, going into the early 40s. So it's just that lovely period to do. And yeah, we were 2 weeks away from filming when lockdown happened. And we'd so many beautiful dresses sitting in your workroom, just hoping that it would come back, and now it has. So yeah, it'll be a very, very different set than we were originally imagining, but I'm so glad that it will actually come about now.
And who's adapted that for screen?
So it's Emily Mortimer's directorial debut. So she's adapted it for the screen and she's directing it, which is lovely.
And is that a project that has long gestated with her, and it's like a passion project?
I think so, yeah. I don't think she had originally planned to direct it, but now I think it's been a couple of years that she's been thinking about it and adapted it, and then they've got a great production team behind it to make it.
Are they people that you've worked with before?
No, so it's Moonage Pictures, and no one on it actually I've worked with before, so it's a whole new team. Which is even my costume team are a whole new team, because we're filming it outside of London. And so it's the first time I've actually been on a job that I've known no one from the beginning, which is funny when you're the designer. But obviously having worked with Jaqueline for so long, and we had, you know, that team. And one of the saddest things I think about now is about being a designer is that often, you know, I can't work with Jaqueline anymore and have to find a new team and a new assistant and supervisor. But I'm really lucky actually with everyone. It's probably the nicest group of people across the board, from the producers to the director to, you know, the DP. Everyone is just so enthusiastic about the project, really wants to make it happen, and our own team we've got together are just brilliant. So I'm very optimistic about it.
Everything's in alignment. So talk us through how that process of you, if you like, being confirmed on the job, was it an availability check, or was it a recommendation? How do you know how you were asked to come to the table in order to discuss taking on the role?
So I signed with an agent last year and they put me forward for it, and so I went in and interviewed and had to do, you know, presentation and mood boards and read the script in advance, and went in and met with them, and then found out I got the job. So that's been a whole part of it, of being a designer now, that I have to be the one to go in and pitch for something, which I haven't had to do in the past. So that's a new skill set. But this was one, I think sometimes you read something and you know, if you know it's something you really want to watch yourself.
Yeah.
And then you, like, going in and meeting Emily, and I responded immediately. She's so enthusiastic and her ideas are brilliant, and I felt like it was something I could do and I really wanted to do. So I was so excited when I found out I got it.
Well, congratulations, obviously. But I think
I haven't actually done it yet, though. So that's
well, this part of the process, which is the corralling of information and combined with your research and your input, is in my opinion is probably one of the best elements of the job, because you're working under your own auspices and collaborating with your teams as well as the production team. And when you feel that you're on a journey and everything's kind of ticking, you're ticking boxes, but you're also meeting the criteria and progressing, I think that's just so exciting. And yeah, no, it's wonderful, and it's a fantastic opportunity to be doing it on a project that ultimately, now with everything that's been going on, will be very contained and very secure.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's quite daunting, and a project like this was sort of daunting in the beginning, but now we have to just think about it in a different way. But I'm getting more and more excited about things coming out, because until you see it as, the finished product, it's trying to figure out, oh, did I do a good job? Did it look good? Did I make the right choice here and here? And when you're an assistant designer, that's not on you in the same way it is as a designer. So
Absolutely. The burden of responsibility is on your shoulders, and your team will need you to lead them in that way.
Yeah, someone asked me recently about the difference between, being an assistant designer and being a designer. And I was saying, on one hand, you haven't got that responsibility, but on the other hand, having been an assistant designer for so long, you get to know, I feel like I know Jaqueline's taste really well, but also you're kind of making decisions with someone else's taste in mind and viewpoint in mind, and what you think they'll like or what you think they might not like. So you have to really kind of recalibrate your brain in a way. But also sometimes it is nice to think, oh God, I have, this is my kind of final say here, so I can decide yes or no and not kind of have to worry about whether or not that's been, that's the right choice or the wrong choice, in a sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely a different way of thinking.
And your choice and artistic decisions are at the point that you're at, are so governed by your relationship with your collaborators and your own efforts. It's kind of do or die, isn't it? Because you can't rely on anyone else to come forward with whether it's a color palette or a shape, and working with performers and trying to mold them into your understanding of the narrative is, the onus is on you, and that's a world away from being an assistant or any other member of the costume team.
Yeah, it's a very different kind of, it's a different skill set in a way, but what I'm so grateful for is to have had the opportunity to work with someone like Jaqueline, for the last 10 years, and to assist Lindy. And obviously Jaqueline assisted Lindy, and I've worked with the guy Speranza as well, and he has assisted Lindy. So they all have a similar sort of approach to costume design in a way, but they're incredibly talented. And it's great to have been able to watch them in fittings and watch how they work and how they collaborate with directors and actors and everyone, and learn from them, and then see, because I couldn't imagine doing this. Just kind of, I think sometimes people rock up and they think, oh, I'm a costume designer, and you can just call yourself a costume designer. But I think actually having that experience of working on massive films, working on small films, doing all of those kind of things as an assistant designer, you learn so much by just being in those rooms without necessarily being the one in charge in those rooms. So yeah, I couldn't imagine being in this position if I hadn't have had those 10 years as an assistant designer.
Well, the key word you just used was watching, and then having the curiosity. Have you worked in general wardrobe? Have you gone into just crowd dressing and standing by? Are those roles that were offered to you? Or
I did work, actually. Jaqueline was the one who said to me, you need to go and do a couple of jobs as a standby, because it's so important to understand how things work on set. and understand that pressure and that standbys get put under, and the level of responsibility a standby has. Because I think, as with anything, you need to know what you're asking your team to do, and it's really important to get that experience. And so I did a couple of jobs as a standby, but I have to admit I wasn't very good. So yeah, I was quite key. I found that being on a set floor very stressful for a long amount of time. But yeah, so I have done a couple of jobs as standby, and I've done a fair amount of crowd dressing. Just in between jobs, it's always quite nice to go in and do crowd fittings, and I love doing crowd fittings, actually, I have to say.
Well, that's the formulation of the look, isn't it, in terms of...
Yeah, and when you're an assistant designer, and again, it's quite full on, and you've got a lot of responsibility, and it's nice then when you finish a job and you can go in as a daily and maybe do crowd fittings for a week or two on someone else's job, and you get given a brief, and then you get to work on it, and it's just a really enjoyable experience, I find, doing crowd fittings. But yeah, so I have had that experience, but mainly I've been assistant designing.
When you've been brought in to do a block of crowd, is that costumes that are presented to you, and then you allocate them to performers that come in on that day, or is it more extensive than that? Do you source those costumes and then hand them in and then work with them to prepare for the scene?
So for me personally, if I've gone in on a job, I've tended to go in as a daily, and I've just kind of gone into the crowd fitting room and worked with the other crowd fitters. So you'll have a pool of stock that then you pull from depending on the sporting artist that comes in. As an assistant designer, you'll often then, so on certain jobs, you might have 2 or 3 assistant designers. So one person might be looking after principal women, one person might be looking after principal men, and then the third assistant designer might be looking after crowd. So they would be working with the crowd team and pulling the crowd costumes and getting that stock together. So on smaller jobs, if you're the assistant designer, you might be doing kind of all 3 of those roles. So you might be the one to pull the crowd stock as well as doing the principal stock, and you'll kind of have a pool of stock together, but then you will get different people to come in and actually do those fittings. Or maybe on a smaller job, you just might do the crowd fittings and you might do the principal fittings. It really just depends on the scale.
And it's beholden on you as a member of the team to be as flexible as you can be, so that so that you're always brought back in for either that job further down the line or any other job, because it's all about being part of the team and communicating and collaborating. Have you got a preference in terms of whether you're working with men's or ladies' clothing?
My experience, I've tended to be doing a lot more women's clothing. So assistant designing for Jaqueline, when she's had more than one assistant designer, it's been a bigger job, I've been doing principal women. So I have a lot more experience doing women's costumes, but I love doing men's costumes and actually learning a lot more about men's costumes. But I've tended not to be brought in specifically to do men.
And it's costuming aside, it's also about being able to talk to the performer and explain to the performer what it is that you're hoping to achieve, and whether it's a crowd day player or a crowd person or a day player with a speaking part, that they all deserve to understand what it is that you're trying to achieve. And presumably that comes from, is it sort of tone meetings that you all have together at points where everyone has an understanding of the direction that you're going in terms of color and shapes?
I think early on when you do your reference, you do very specific kind of mood boards for different scenes and different parts of the film or the script. And so, if you're doing a scene at the Ritz, let's say, you'll have your kind of boards of what everyone would have been wearing, depending on who they were, and the date. And so the designer would talk through everyone in the team, all the different boards for all the different scenes. And then they then would go on, if they're doing crowd fittings, to have those boards in the room so that they can refer back to them. Specifically, if there's specific colors that you're using, or there's colors you aren't using, or patterns. And that's why it is good to have an assistant designer in those rooms or involved in kind of getting the stock together, because they will have had that bit more time with the designer and kind of have more of a sense of what the overall look you're going for is. And so then as the same thing goes with principal fittings. You'll always have reference to show and kind of where your ideas have come from and what the journey is. You might put some things on a stand or just to show the actor so that they get an idea in their head before you just start putting clothes on.
Yeah, there'd be no point in presenting a performer with a fait accompli.
Oh no,
because you'd immediately come up against a brick wall, understandably, because it's about drawing them into the world, and that would have to be part of your process. So are those pre-meetings, one always imagines it in terms of the difference between the world of theatre and opera and then the world of film and television. One imagines that there's never enough time with film and television to actually be able to take people to one side, your teams, once the decisions have been made in terms of what something's going to look like, which usually starts from the very beginning. What kind of conscious attempt is made to, as you progress and as timing allows, to kind of determine that look is stuck to and adhered to? Is that a difficult challenge because of the nature of filming?
I mean, you're always up against the clock with filming, but I think you tend to plan in advance so that with something like crowd or principal fittings, you've got enough time in an ideal world so that the crowd boards would be presented to a designer. And when I say the crowd boards, it would be pictures of the essays in their finished look. And then the designer will go through them and see them as a group and make notes and comments so that changes can be made. The same thing with the principal fitting is at every step of the way, you will go to a director, to the director, to the DP, you'll show them what you're doing and where you're going so that everyone's on board. I mean, often you get last minute casting and that just is what it is. But ideally you would never have an actor going to set in a costume that the director hasn't some idea of what's coming along.
Yeah.
Because, once you're filming, it's very hard to change things on the day. Yeah, that's the worst kind of situation to be in, is when you get an actor the night before and you have to just hope they like what you've got and that it makes sense to them and that it fits, and then you hope that the director likes it. But ideally you wouldn't get to that point. Even if you might not be able to get your actor until a few days before. Sometimes you might try and find someone, an SA or someone that's the same build, the same kind of look, so that you'll try the costume in advance, so that you're not kind of in that position of having nothing on the day.
And it's always acknowledging that you as part of that creative process are beholden to ensure that in order for your process to be as straightforward as possible, everybody is in the loop. And I don't just mean your team, I mean, as you just said, the DOP, the director, producers, so that when it gets to the crunch point in front of the camera, where it's literally costing, pounds by the second, it can flow.
Yeah, completely. I mean, I think that's one of the biggest things about being the designer, is that you have to make sure you have to keep having these conversations, because the whole thing is a collaboration in a sense, and you need to know that it works with what the production designer is doing, that it's a color that the DP likes, that it's the director is on, but it's very hard to just think that you can turn up on the day with a costume and that it's all going to work out. There has to be a lot of planning in advance.
And is that something that you were aware of from the get-go in terms of watching the process as a trainee? Could you see clearly how the mindset has to sort of be all over it, but at the same time focus?
I think as a trainee, I think as you work your way up, the pressure and the responsibility gets bigger and bigger. So as a trainee, and then I went on to be a buyer, you kind of you might get your set of things you're doing that day, and then you go and do them, but you're not necessarily involved in the bigger picture or the kind of bigger conversations in a sense. But as an assistant designer, definitely, in a lot of ways, you try and take the burden away from the costume designer to have to filter down the information to your department. So an assistant designer, kind of their responsibility is often after a fitting to do all the follow-up, go and talk to the makers, talk to the costume houses, talk to your team, making sure that all the different people who have to work on the costume know what's going on and have that information passed on, so that the costume designer is free to go and follow up with the director and all of those kind of people, because I think the one thing I've realized as being the designer is you kind of end up in endless meetings. So many meetings, which as an assistant designer, you don't have to go to those things. Your kind of meetings take place within your department. So yeah, that's been the change.
Again, for the sake of our audience, you were lucky enough to have worked with Jaqueline on Little Women, and which received awards galore, which deservedly. And that was an interesting job for you in the sense that you started the prep in the UK and then very quickly shifted to North America. And that was always going to be the case, but there was a point where, what was the balance in terms of the ratio of working here prior to going there? Was that because of casting, or was it because of security in terms of knowing your resources here better than you would have perhaps known them in North America for a period production?
I think, to be honest, they agreed to it because they wanted Jaqueline to do it. And, she's got a family and wanted to be here. And her view was that you could get the costumes here, and she wanted to work in the costume houses where she was used to working. So was pushed to be able to prep here, and then for us to go over there. And yeah, in a way, we got the best of both worlds. We were able to do a lot here, and there's just a lot more costumes here to choose from. And some of the cast were here, and then some of the cast actually came to the UK to be fitted, and a huge amount was made here. But actually, the thing about working in America is it's not like working in London, that if you're based in London, you've got access to all the costume houses and you can go to them. You can be on set in the morning and then go to the costume house in the afternoon. I mean, we were filming in Concord, in Massachusetts, miles away from even a fabric shop. So you kind of may as well have been prepping in London as prepping in LA in terms of the distance.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it just, for us to be able to manufacture, I suppose, where you're more familiar with the makers and everything like that, it just, it made such a difference. And then when we got over there, we also had an in-house team who were working over there and had a whole American team. So it was just Jaqueline and I that went from there, but we still had people working in London and working in Boston at the same time.
Right. So in terms of your comfort zone, as best as you could beforehand, you structured it in a way that you were able to get the best of both worlds. Did that then mean that the schedule of filming was very tight, so that you knew well ahead when everything needed to be ready and shipped in and brought to you, or was it a little bit more haphazard than that?
It's a little bit more haphazard. We had a lot of late nights on that, just kind of finishing things off.
Well, as they shifted around the schedule and
I'm trying to remember now, really. I think the schedule was fairly locked, but again, the volume of what we had to do. I mean, there were just so many balls and dresses, and because all of the girls were going across two sort of periods in their lives, and we knew that would be intercut, trying to make that work. So yeah, I mean, just the volume of what had to be done for that production was quite huge.
And then in comparison to the volume, were you contained within one environment? I mean, obviously shooting different locations, but in essence, were you able to operate out of one base, or were you constantly on the move?
Yeah, we operated out of one base when we were there. Lived in one hotel on a roundabout for 3 months in the middle of winter in Billerica, the small town in Boston. So yeah, it was definitely an experience.
All of that experience feeds into the desire. It's just the preconcept of, if you like, of people thinking that a period production, oh yes, it's just about going out and finding bits of trim here and a dress there, but the enormity of creating a world, in particular in this instance a particular time and period that is not often recreated. In essence, there isn't that much existing stock that can be drawn out of supply houses and resources and perhaps retrimmed, or given something that will create a different impression. in essence, it would all need to be, you'd need to have to start again.
Yeah, I mean, I think regardless of where that was filmed, we would have had to rely on European costume houses as well as London as well as American, because you just to try and, as you say, find the stock that exists. And then it's not just finding the stock that exists, but exists within the palette and the design for each scene and the brief and yeah, the whole thing. So it's a huge undertaking, and you need to know at the beginning. I mean, it wasn't my responsibility on that, but it is like a jigsaw puzzle where you're trying to work out your stock based on the schedule to know that you've got enough time to do your fittings, to do your turnaround, to make sure that like if a certain group of dresses are being worn on one day, you know that they're not going to work for another 10 days because you've got to use those same ones again and retrim them and refit them on 10 different people so that they can work again the following week. And that's a whole maths problem, because if the schedule suddenly changes and those two filming days are next to each other, then you haven't got enough outfits. Even with your evening wear for men, you know, you need to make sure you've got enough to cover yourself for the various different scenes that are going to appear and where they appear in the schedule. And if those costumes just don't exist, then you've got a real problem.
Not that this is your job title, but the logistics of the subsequent cleaning and processing of those items in order for them to then be ready for that next block of shooting in itself is a logistical nightmare, because you're dependent upon the relationship that you have with your supervisor and their team. And I'm assuming that through the teams of people that you've worked with, i.e. Lindy and Guy and Jaqueline, that knowing that knowing that they have very good relationships with their supervisors, I'm presuming that that's something that's been drummed into you and you understand as being absolutely vital in terms of the smooth running of your process.
Completely. I mean, I've always understood how important it is for a supervisor, but you kind of realize when you start to get involved with things like the logistics, which I had to do because of us being based in London and then having to go over there, you realize just how much of a complex problem it is. Like that, to do with the scheduling, to do, just in terms of deliveries and making sure things turn up on time. Everything is so time sensitive that you really have to be on it, and you can't forget something because that can have a huge implication. And as a designer and working on smaller projects myself, I'm having to do a lot more of that. And you just realize that actually you need to be on top of all of those things. You need to be on top of when you're going to do your pickups, when you're going to do your returns, how much time in between to have things cleaned, the budget implications of all of those things, because, you know, just one decision can turn you, you know, can upset your budget. So yeah, I mean, having a great supervisor is just makes everything so much easier.
In terms of finding that supervisor, it's about, I suppose, ultimately you asking the right questions at that point of interview in order to assess whether that supervisor is going to be the best person for your job. Because obviously different supervisors have got different skill sets that they can apply, whether it could be manufacturing in terms of their interest as well as their ability, or whether it is somebody that is happy to sit behind a computer at a desk and pump away at diaries and calendars and, you know, making inordinate amounts of phone calls and liaising with production managers and producers.
Yeah, I think it depends on the type of job, and often certain supervisors are drawn to certain jobs as well because they might have done quite a few jobs like you've just described, which when it's the bigger jobs, they're involved with that side of it, which is much more kind of the running and the day-to-day and the budget. And sometimes they love to go and do a small job because it means they're involved with the costumes again, and they're kind of having to do a lot more of the hands-on things, and they're back on the costume truck. But really, I think for a supervisor in particular, the nature of the job kind of dictates what they end up doing every day. Like that again, they end up in lots and lots of meetings and logistical meetings, and I think, you know, good producers really know the value of a good supervisor because they can be reassured that there are going to be costumes on the day and things that are going to run smoothly, and that's a big responsibility for a supervisor.
Oh, I absolutely agree with you, and I find that as the years go on and I see more and more of people's working practice, you realize that a costume supervisor can actually make or break the process of a production and how it proceeds. And it's been so interesting going through this series of chats with everyone in terms of the evaluation that people have for their own role as well as the role of the people that are around them. And I think it's very encouraging to know that there are so many different, if you like, roles that can be filled, and then even within those roles, the different levels of application and if you like, job requirements. But it's been interesting chatting with you about all of this. But there is something that I wanted to touch on that I think in terms of where we're all going and how we're heading towards a direction globally in terms of sustainability and best and what's considered to be best practice. I've one of the key things that I've always been interested and curious about with you, Sinead, is your belief in sustainability within the costume department in terms of the function and how we operate as practitioners with the world and on a global level where we're heading in terms of resources and trying to protect the environment.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's something that I started to think about probably almost 10 years ago when I started working in this industry. Was just realizing the volume of what we produce and the kind of social responsibility we have of thinking about what we produce. And more and more, I mean, particularly even at the moment when you see what's happened in the last few months to our industry and realizing that there is no built-in resilience to look after us. We kind of are, I suppose, a production company's responsibility to us in a lot of ways starts with, a script and it ends with the premiere, and what kind of happens after that, is not necessarily being thought about because we're all freelance and we move from one short-term job to another short-term job, and there's never enough time and there's never enough money, and the main aim is to produce a film or a television program or a theater production that looks beautiful and is incredible and is meaningful in that sense. But when I think about our industry and where we're going to be in 10, 15, 20 years, I just don't know what we're doing, I suppose, to make sure that our industry is catching up with the world around it and it is viable, can exist in that time. And I think to myself that, 2050, if I'm lucky, I'll be able to retire around 2050. And that's about the time when all the climate change people are saying, will have gone too far at that point. And all of the scientists are saying to us, we need to drastically reduce our impact, our carbon footprint by 2030, or it'll be too late, essentially. That is the time we've got to reduce our impact by 45%. And since I've started in the industry, all I've seen is the amount we consume, and as costume designers in particular, we are massive consumers, and that consumption has just increased. And that's because in the wider society, with fast fashion and textile production and kind of the ease and convenience of the way we now shop, people are shopping more and more, but we just don't stop and think. And in a way, the older generation of designers I talk to, they always say, well, it never used to be like this. We never used to, buy this much, and we never used to waste this much. And then I see the trainees and juniors that I work with that come in and they're all going, well, why is it like this? Why are we wasting so much? And I feel like it's up to us that are kind of in between to sort of say, actually, let's stop and think about what we're doing. And I mean, just from a social point of view, for me, it's never really sat right that where we manufacture kind of in the developing world, and there's people who make clothing for a living just like the rest of us, but they're working in awful conditions. And we then go to the high street, we go to places like Primark and think it's okay to buy something that's £2, but there's like 10 people who have to get paid and a profit margin and all of those things.
It's also determined by how the criteria of actually physically shooting and creating a production has shifted in terms of timing and digitization, availability of clothing at a price in order to fit into the criteria of a budget. And not to dismiss the points that you're trying to make, but you've got a generation of practitioners who have said it never used to be like this. What's happened? And what's happened is actually on a global scale, the world has shifted from something that would have taken, an amount of time to create, now has to be done in half that time for half that cost.
That is true, but I think our impact as consumers, I think it's across the board, the film industry needs to change, and the film industry is highly unregulated in a sense. There's lots of problems with the industry as a whole, but one of them is that it's not regulated. It's short-term contracts, and that needs to change in a sense, but the only people who can change it are those of us working within it.
Yes.
And we can shift the culture and we can change the culture. And often we say things like, oh, this is just the way we do it because this is the way it's been, it's always been done, and there's not enough time and there's not enough money and everything. And I completely appreciate that. I know what it's like when you get casting the day before and you've just got to go and find something for someone to wear. But I also think so I created something called the costume directory, which the aim of it was just sharing the information that I had and giving people access to suppliers that are trying to do the right thing, and giving people access to information about different ways of sourcing, and looking at the textiles we're using, and looking at where things are coming from, and looking at the certifications that you should look for to make sure that the people who are manufacturing these textiles are paid a living wage. Or also just showing people how easy it is now to shop secondhand. I mean, one thing we do, which is amazing, is we use costume houses and we hire clothing rather than manufacturing it from new. And that's amazing because on one hand, costume designers really value things that are 100 years old, and we reuse clothing over and over again, and that's brilliant. But that doesn't happen on a lot of films, and a lot of the big blockbuster films in particular, where they have a lot of money, their budgets are huge, and so their capacity to make a difference is also huge. So they can look at clothing, and I think often people get fixated on certain aspects of like air travel, for example, but the fashion and textiles industry is 8% of global emissions. The airline industry is 2%. And yet, even as the film industry tries to move to the BFI have recently produced a study, and they're trying to look at ways to get the film industry to move to a net zero carbon emissions, which is very admirable. But actually, the reality is very few people think about how our department works, and in all their analysis of the film industry as a whole and its carbon impact, costume doesn't even figure. So it's just not even calculated. No one knows what our impact is. And when you look at the impact of the fashion and textiles industry, and then you think about what we manufacture and our output, actually our impact is huge. And I'm not saying it's going to change overnight, and I'm in no way an expert on sustainability, or I'm a filmmaker, but I think you have to look at kind of the people working in our industry and say, what can we do and where do we want to be? And if we want to go and say we're going to be net zero carbon emissions by 2030, which is kind of where we need to be, how are we going to get there? Like, what are we going to do to get there? And the reality is we can either do nothing and then just get to a point where our industry is considered unsustainable, or we have to modernize overnight, or we can try and look at changing the culture. We can set ourselves targets. We can look at the things that we actively do and see if there's ways that we can change them. I mean, we can just, even looking at our mileage, looking at our waste, not thinking of things, just changing the culture of how we think about clothing to value it again, so that if we're buying stuff from the high street, it doesn't matter if it's cheap. If we're not going to use it, let's return it. Even when you've got high profile actors and you're buying them new tracksuits, new trainers, so much underwear that doesn't get used or returned, and then at the end you're just left with this mountain of clothing. Like, that clothing, it doesn't matter if you give it to a charity shop at the end, it's still adding to the kind of consumption, the mass consumption that is a big problem in our society. And I think, I'm not saying I have the answers in any way, shape or form. I just think actually we need to start personally taking responsibility for the future of our industry, because no one else is. And unless we start thinking about it and start talking about it and start thinking of ways that actually we can make changes, and there's loads of ways that we can make really simple changes that aren't a hassle or that won't make a difference to our creative output.
Yeah, beholden on us to take that initiative and to understand it and to educate our teams accordingly. I'm going to be quite contentious here, but it's also about shifting what the perception of value is. And you touched on the point that if you like, the costume houses and supply houses as resources exist as businesses, but primarily they exist in a situation where they benefit everybody. And what seems to have also changed in terms of the argument that we're having about trying to control this consumption is that at the top of the tree, the studios consider that the costumes that they create, produce, purchase, acquire, however they do it, is the perception is that these clothes are considered assets after they've been used. And it's an interesting dynamic that we're constantly faced with as suppliers, that clothing that would come back into this business and subsequently be available for, multiple use is prevented from coming back in that way without some kind of exorbitant charge attached to it, an overinflated charge, because of the perception that this is clothing that was used in this production, therefore it has a value that is beyond its retail value and beyond its commercial value as an item. And I think that should shift in terms of clothing that you're saying is purchased and found at great expense and use of resources and basically sits in boxes in some storage somewhere, never to see the light of day again, when it could be out there regenerating itself and being used in such a variety of different ways.
I think that's the thing. I think it's just looking at, not just the sort of financial cost of something, but the actual carbon cost of something. And I think actually we'll have to get to a point where that is rationed to a certain degree, but we're not going to get there anytime soon if no one's actually acknowledging the problem that exists.
Maybe productions need to bring in maybe there's a job title, maybe there's a role for somebody specifically, unless there already is, and I'm not aware of it, but I'm always intrigued by the idea that perhaps somebody like there is in theory going to be somebody that is brought in as, if you like, a COVID specialist in terms of best practice. Maybe there needs to be somebody that is brought in to be the sustainability person.
Well, they often have on certain jobs, they often have what they call it like a sustainability runner, who do a great job, but they're looking at the overall things that the film industry in general looks at in terms of sustainability, which is catering, which is very important, and recycling. But the bigger kind of thing in terms of the materials that are bought and the energy usage and all of those things kind of that don't happen on the actual set floor, I think are largely overlooked at the moment. And that is to do with, there are some great organizations. I work closely with them. BAFTA have an affiliate called Albert who look at sustainability, but they have difficulties kind of actually just getting access, getting information from the studios, getting in there. And so I recently joined a group called Cut It, which is about basically filmmakers for the climate crisis. And what's brilliant is it's a group of not just costume designers, but it's cinematographers, gaffers, production designers, actors. So it's all people from across the field coming together saying, we're not experts, but we know something needs to change in our industry. And we're looking at different ways. And a few of the things that we're actually doing from a costume point of view is, one, getting really targeted education for teams. So like myself included, what we were saying at the beginning of a job that would be really helpful is to have training, and not just kind of the same training you get for like health and safety that people kind of do and fill out a form and say they've done it, but that's actually really practical and structured by someone who understands the industry, who understands how our department works, who understands the complex nature of why you have to get things in a hurry, or the kind of fabrics you have to use, or the different things, but just to give people a broader understanding of actually the impact we have on a daily basis and where we have opportunities to make a change, and getting a whole team involved. So it's not just about the HOD saying what they can do. It's like, I think we can learn a huge amount from our juniors and trainees that come in. They know far more about sustainability than we do. They know a lot more about things like circular design and different ways of doing things, and just shifting the culture and the way we think. I think that's a big thing we can do. And so we're pushing for that at the moment. And the other thing is trying to get us to self-audit in a way. So Albert, we're working together to come up with a calculator so that actually buyers can track their mileage. We can track what we're buying. We can track what fabrics we're using, and then they will analyze it and say, actually, this is your overall impact, and this is where you could make significant changes. Because I think no one wants to be pestered while they're at work and told, oh, you're using the wrong kind of plastic bottle, or you're using the wrong kind of spoon. We're all under such pressure all the time that sometimes we get bogged down with focusing on things like that are in front of us, like plastic bags or plastic bottles, or the recycling. But actually there's bigger issues like our energy use, the way the diesel generators we use to kind of have our marquees going, and then the big thing is the resources that go into manufacturing textiles. And so if we can source a lot more secondhand, if we can hire a lot more, that will make a massive difference in terms of the overall impact. And I think that's the way we have to move now. And the mindset is changing, because people are in this moment of lockdown thinking a bit more long term, and thinking a bit more about the future and actually where the industry is going and where it needs to be. And I think collectively we just need to have these discussions, because often there's lots of people doing really brilliant things, but doing them in isolation, because we don't kind of have one fixed infrastructure that we use and we keep returning to. So each time you start a job, it's like Groundhog Day. You're starting from scratch. You're starting a new office. They're kitting out a new kitchen for you. They're bringing in desks. You're setting up rails, everything. And then you get to the end and you're left with all this stuff and you're wondering where to go. And this happens constantly. And so lots of people are trying to do things. But now we're just trying to streamline that and get lots of people doing things together so that we can kind of move forward and try and think differently.
Well, I take my hat off to you. I think it's an amazing initiative. I've been watching it. I know your compendium that you put together for resources, and what we'll do actually is put the details of the website and the organization, on the front page of our podcast, because I think it, absolutely deserves it, and it's a very important aspect of our way forward. I've noticed on a few of the BBC closing credits that they detail that there are Albert Sustainable Production. Is that in direct connection with this initiative?
Yeah, so Albert are that body that's they're funded by a lot of the TV broadcasters, so BBC, BAFTA, BFI, and they so productions have to meet certain criteria in order to get that accreditation.
Right.
And again, I've worked very closely with them and they've been very supportive, but it's only recently that we've discovered that actually costume doesn't even figure. So that's something that we're working together to try and change, because I think, again, unless you work in our industry, you really don't know what happens behind the scenes. And sometimes people fail to think where that army have come from that are on set suddenly. They just haven't really thought about the journey or the breakdown process or the washing and drying or all of those factors that make a difference.
That have become so much part of the everyday. So Sinead, just to wrap up our lovely little chat here, what would you say going forward? Is there a single piece of advice that you'd offer to somebody wanting to enter our industry as a designer?
I think probably what I said earlier on, which is about just working hard. I mean, it sounds like a cliche, but that saying that hard work beats talent if talent doesn't work hard. I think I say that all the time, because I just think actually if you're getting into this industry and you work really hard, people will see that, and you'll be such a valuable addition to any team if you're willing to work hard. So yeah, that'll be my one piece of advice.
Well, that's an invaluable piece of advice, and I really appreciate you giving us the time, especially as you're in the midst of startup again, and look forward to seeing you.
Thank you very much for having me.
over the next couple of weeks. And Sinead, thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. It's been lovely.
That was Jonathan's chat with Sinead. A fascinating conversation, especially near the tail end of it as well, with the reusable and the recyclable and the environmental side of things. And I know I mentioned at the end of last week's interview, it's an interesting conversation to have with you, Jonathan, because it's sort of how you work in the making departments, especially with things like fur and things like that. But you do reuse as much as you possibly can rather than go out and buy only if you have to. Is that right?
Yes, we do. We try and regenerate. We try and renovate. We try and utilize fabric that may be frayed in one section that somebody would deem as disposable. We don't, that's, if you like, that's the motto of a costume house. It doesn't matter whether it's us, Cosprop, whoever. The idea is that you're only as good as your resource.
Nothing's beyond redemption.
Nothing's beyond redemption. And also, that costuming, in its purest sense, is using,
existing thing. Yeah.
If we go back to the Roger Tonks school of costuming, where 1 minute you're turning a mess jacket into an officer's naval tropical dress, to then it becomes a flunky, to then it becomes it's changing buttons and
all those Chelsea pensioner red coats that were turned into tailcoats and things. It's true, and of course, I've had people say, "Oh, do you ever throw things away?" Well, of course we do occasionally, but even the most tatty garment can go into the tramp section, or what's that? I can't remember whether they call it the prostitutes or the whores section now, but it's one of those, isn't it? Sort of ladies of the night section, where it's sort of faded finery and things that are sort of worn there. And actually, those costumes are as valuable as any other costume, if not more so, because they're already broken down and aged.
I love the way that when somebody who doesn't know asks the question, so do I pay less? Taking something that's essentially ripped to shreds, or do I pay less for a kid's costume because it's smaller than an adult?
I know that cropped up the other day with me. And I go, well, how many layers is it? Well, it's the same layers. Oh, okay, then fine. So it's just a miniature adult, really, then, isn't it? Speaking as a miniature adult.
Then a light bulb goes on over their head. Oh yeah.
I was going to say, I think you made a very, very pertinent point, Jonathan, and it's something I've never understood, how that on a film or a TV production they can spend thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds recreating, say, a medieval banqueting hall, and the day they finish wrapping it, it's scrapped and it's in a skip. But the costumes that they've spent thousands creating for that banqueting hall are suddenly assets and have a huge value, and this is a point that you make in the interview. So all of the stuff, the scenery, construction stuff, is just got rid of, but somehow production seem to think that there's another value to this, and of course it's grossly unfair. If you're prepared to spend the money making those costumes for the production, that's what you spent the money on.
Yes. Yeah, why does it then have to become tangibly something else?
Yeah, and I feel very, very strongly, as I know we all do, that we as a costume house, not just us, every costume house is only as good as its stock, and its stock is only re-energized and revitalized by new things coming in. And what does it gain a production company to keep a load of costumes that they've made for Troy or one of those big sword and sandals things for years in skips, and not let other people have access to them and not have them reused again? And it comes back to this thing about repurposing things, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Listening to everything Sinead was saying on this side of stuff, and I think the one of the biggest things I took away from it is when she says, I'm not an expert, but I'm a film person, but she has an opinion on it and she has a view on it and she feels passionate about it. And there are enough people who should have the same feel and passion about it, because it's looking at the much bigger picture, which is so much harder to do in the film industry, because all you're concentrating on is where's the next job and making this job perfect. So to actually have someone who's championing this and admits it's not her forte, but she is pushing it as hard as she can and trying to make such a change is fantastic.
No, we have had productions who've said, look, we're not expecting to get any money for this stock. We'd rather you had it, but can you maybe look at the next time round and do us some sort of deal on the next lot of hires, which is a far more healthy and positive attitude than going, we want £50,000 for this show, please. And
that ascribes to Sinead's point of view in terms of how the channels of communication should always be open, and dialogue between vendor, supplier, buyer, need to flow. And the problem is as we have seen in the current situation that we're all in, there was, if you like, a lull in the hyperactivity that goes with production making, whether it's film, television, even theatre, and where people were coming to the table to talk and discuss issues, albeit mostly related to COVID situation. But along with that comes the bigger talk about, what do we do going forward in terms of our working practice. And notice I didn't say practitioners. apparently there's a bet out there amongst a regular audience about the number of times that I say practitioner.
There is another one about the number of times I say really, is there?
That was just in City Rats.
Really?
I really
like.
The next conversation we're releasing is my conversation with Nat Turner. Nat is just starting onto his design career now. He has been an assistant, he has been a standby, and he has worked in the costume department.
For us,
For us, he started off with us, and similarly to Sinead, he worked with Lindy Hemming. Actually, he worked with Lindy for quite a long time, actually. So I sat down and talked with Nat about his career, and it was a really nice chat, and it's someone who cares passionately about what he does, and I'm looking forward to releasing it. And here is a small excerpt from my conversation with Nat Turner.
Paddington's like the most beautiful film ever made, and it's just joy. The positivity that those films sort of spread, I think, is one of the most valuable things I've been involved with. And in terms of the creative process, it's just genius because it's caricature, but it isn't. They're so colourful, those films, that they're quite complicated in terms of trying to figure out, again, timelines of characters, because for instance on the first film we were kind of using red as a signifier for people's happiness and stuff, being that it is the same color as Paddington's hat, but at certain points Paul would say, I want them to wear this red in this scene, and we'd be like, but that other person's wearing that red, and you just get a whole sea of red everywhere. So it was very interesting in terms of trying to deal with the sheer amount of colour that Paul wanted to put in there. And obviously the sets and the production design are unbelievable as well. And we were all sort of going down the same thing, but it was worrying to us that we thought it was, I think Lindy thought as well, she thought it was just going to look like madness, because it seemed like we were throwing everything at it, which we were, but it kind of works. It's the kind of the aesthetic